we're safe then. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to make sure your cell phones have been turned off as we start. That's always appreciated. We will post the program on the Heritage homepage sometime tomorrow for your future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our guest today is Dr. Kim Holmes, Distinguished Fellow in our Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies. Dr. Holmes previously served as Heritage's Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies, as well as Director of the Davis Institute. He was a founding editor of the Annual Index of Economic Freedom, which has become a signature Heritage publication. And from 2002 to 2005, it was his privilege to serve in the George W. Bush administration as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Holmes. Kim?
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today. Hal Brands, our guest today, says in his new book, and I quote him on this, that grand strategy is one of the most widely used and abused concepts in the foreign policy lexicon. It is both an alluring and elusive concept, he says. Nevertheless, it's necessary to get grand strategy right, for as hard as it is to articulate and even more difficult to implement, not having a strategy can be as bad as having a wrong one. Now, there's a lot of interest in this question today in America, not only academics, but policymakers, particularly, well, actually, even Democrats or Republicans, are puzzled by the current course of U.S. foreign policy. Some fear the nation's foreign policy is drifting. Only yesterday, the president gave a speech at West Point laying out a vision which I suppose could be described as a strategy, but the question really is it really one at all? Does the president have a coherent strategy, or is he ad-libbing for political purposes? Perhaps Professor Brands can help us answer these questions. Now, I have to admit that despite being a foreign policy intellectual myself, I've often had doubts about whether or not the United States can reasonably be expected to have a grand strategy. America is not Prussia or Germany, I used to think. Also, my experience in government underlined the problems of bureaucracy, of politics, and the crush of rushing to everyday events in trying to implement a grand strategy. But in the end, I've held my skepticism in check. I agree that it's better to try to have a grand strategy than not to try to have one at all. The old saying about military planning is true for grand strategy as well. It's the process of planning that matters more than the actual plan itself. For if you are honest, at least you could be grappling with and trying to answer, hopefully grappling with the right questions and hopefully trying to answer them. Now, the book in question is What Good is Grand Strategy? Power and Purpose in American Statecraft, from Harry S. Truman to George W. Bush. From what I've read, it's a thoughtful and balanced assessment of the problem, and I don't agree with everything in it, but we are much better off for having him written it, and I encourage all of you to read it. As a matter of fact, Hal will be able to stay after shortly to sign some books. We have about 12 copies or so outside which you can purchase. Now, Hal Brands has spent a lot of time thinking about the problems of grand strategy, even when he was an intern here at Heritage in 2008, as it was. He is currently an assistant professor of public policy and history at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He's researched and written extensively on the subject, spending time at the Institute for Defense Analysis and the RAND Corporation. He has served as a member of the RAND Corporation Grand Strategy Advisory Board, and he's an affiliate of the Duke Program in American Grand Strategy and serves on the executive board of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies. So please join me in welcoming Hal Brands to the Heritage Foundation.
thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming out today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Dr. Holmes mentioned, my remarks today are based on a book that I just published on grand strategy, and in particular about how we should think of grand strategy not just as something that academics and historians study, but as something that policymakers actually seek to do. And as Dr. Holmes also mentioned, this is a good time to be talking about this. We are today in the midst of a fairly important debate about the future of American grand strategy, what our goals are, what level of resources we'll be able to devote to those goals, and so on. And this is grand strategy season in D.C. right now. So aside from the president's speech yesterday, we had the release of the QDR. A few weeks ago, we will be having an updated national security strategy released by the White House, presumably any day or any week now. And at the unclassified level, at least, these really are America's grand strategy documents, right? They contain the key judgments about goals, priorities, choices, constraints that guide an administration's approach to the world. And so they invariably set off a pretty loud and noisy debate about that administration's grand strategy, whether it has one, what it is, what its prospects are, and so on. And these debates are always very interesting, but they're perhaps not as clarifying or enlightening as they could be. And that's because I think in a lot of cases they rest on a bit of a misunderstanding as to what grand strategy actually is and what it can realistically accomplish. So today, grand strategy is an extremely prominent and popular concept. It's the subject of books, articles, op-eds, a continually growing number of college programs around the country. It's also a very slippery concept. It's one that gets defined in all sorts of different and sometimes contradictory ways. More often, it simply doesn't get defined at all. And then finally, it's a very polarizing concept. So admirers of grand strategy often treat it as a sort of silver bullet, something that will allow us to overcome the complexity of the international environment and fairly easily locate the answers to all the tough foreign policy questions out there. Its detractors, on the other hand, go completely in the other direction. They treat grand strategy as an illusion, as something that's simply made up by memoirists and historians like me after the fact, and something that just can't be done in real time in a complex and fluid international environment. So I would argue that grand strategy is ultimately misunderstood by both of these groups, by its detractors and its admirers, and that if we want to have a good, well-informed debate about what American grand strategy should be, we have to first make clear what it is that what grand strategy actually is, and then what good it actually does in terms of guiding and improving U.S. foreign policy. And so what I do in the book, and what I'll do over the next half hour or so today, is to try to bring grand strategy down to earth a little bit, and also put it on a bit of a sounder footing. So I'm going to start out by explaining what grand strategy is, or what I think it is, and then why it's both so important and so hard to do. And then I'll talk about what a couple of historical case studies can tell us about what grand strategy actually looks like in real time. And then I'll make a few closing remarks about how we might think about approaching grand strategy as an undertaking going forward. Okay, so starting with what is grand strategy. If you just Google this question, you will find about 1,000 different answers to it. Some of them are very good and very insightful, and some of them are very bad and quite misleading. My own understanding of grand strategy is basically as follows. A grand strategy is essentially an integrated set of principles and priorities that give structure and direction to a country's statecraft. So if you're doing grand strategy, you're not just reacting to events as they happen or handling them on an ad hoc basis. You have a more purposeful and coherent set of ideas about what your country is out to accomplish in the world and how it ought to go about doing so. In particular, I think a grand strategy requires a considered understanding of the major trends and characteristics in the international environment, a country's highest goals and objectives within that environment, the major threats to those goals and objectives, and then the ways that finite resources can be deployed to deal with these competing challenges and opportunities. And if you have a grand strategy, you're not just sort of doing this as an academic exercise. These ideas should actually be driving your day-to-day interactions with the world, how you deploy military resources, how you use foreign aid, even things as mundane as how much time and energy you're willing to spend on given policy problems. I like to think of grand strategy really as the connective tissue that binds a country's highest interests to its everyday dealings with the world. It's the conceptual framework that helps nations determine where they want to go and how they want to get there. It's the theory or the logic that guides leaders seeking security in a complex world. So that's a big picture definition of grand strategy. Let me just make a handful of additional points that I think can clarify some key aspects of that concept. Grand strategy is about linkages. It's about understanding how diverse events and policies relate to one another, and then relating them in your foreign policy to a broader conception of national goals and interests. Grand strategy is about focus. It's about keeping your eye on the ball on those long-term objectives, even as you're constantly being waylaid by crises. Grand strategy is about linking the short-term to the long-term. It's about deciding where we want to be several years from now, and then orienting our policies today and tomorrow toward that goal. Grand strategy is about trade-offs. Not even superpowers have enough resources to deal with every problem and opportunity adequately. And so you have to prioritize and choose which ones are truly most important. Grand strategy is about implementation as well as conception. It involves not simply figuring out the key concepts that will drive a country's foreign policy. That's in a lot of ways the easy part. But then actually working through the bureaucracy and the political process to turn those ideas into action, and that's often the hard part. Grand strategy is about maximizing national power while also preserving it. National power consists of all sorts of things. It has military dimensions, economic dimensions, ideological dimensions, diplomatic dimensions. And so a good grand strategy entails using all those things and combining them to achieve important goals. But it also entails rationing power and using it prudently, not pouring so many resources into any one particular objective or area that you're hurting the broader scheme of U.S. foreign policy. This was one of B.H. Liddell Hart's key insights about grand strategy, and I think it remains pertinent today. And then finally, grand strategy is about process. It's about process in the sense that coming up with a grand strategy generally requires pre-hoc, deliberate thinking. You can't just sort of make it up on the fly. But it's also about process in that grand strategy is itself a process that never really ends. The world never sits still. Conditions are constantly changing, and so even if the basic goals and principles of your grand strategy remain constant over time, the day-to-day policies you employ to achieve them are going to continually be evolving. So think about containment, for instance. That was a case where the overarching aim of U.S. policy persisted for over 4 decades. But what containment actually meant in policy terms changed considerably, sometimes dramatically, from year to year, from administration to administration. So containment involved an ongoing process of adaptation and change, and the same is true of grand strategy today. Now that's a pretty lengthy list of characteristics, and perhaps needless to say, getting all this stuff right can be quite tricky. And so that brings me to 2 extra points about grand strategy, that it's essential to good policy, but that it can be damn hard to do well. Okay, so why is grand strategy so important? Well, it's important precisely because the world is complicated, because our resources are finite, because we are constantly confronted by crises. It's important because the United States has interests all over the globe and has to deal with dozens of issues on a day-to-day basis. It's most important simply because there's no alternative to having to make decisions about priorities and trade-offs. These type of choices are simply inherent in the process of governing. And so because of all these things, you need some conceptual framework that will help you make these choices as consciously and intelligently as you can. You need that overarching logic that will give some degree of order and focus to policy. And that'll make sure that the various pieces of your foreign policy aren't undermining each other or flying off in 10 different directions. You need that theory that helps you use your resources efficiently and figure out how individual issues pertain to a broader, more cohesive whole. And so I would argue that if you want to do foreign policy intelligently, there's really no good alternative to doing grand strategy. And I would just illustrate this by saying that if you look at recent administrations that have explicitly downplayed the importance of grand strategy, and so here I'm thinking particularly of the Clinton administration, in which the president himself famously said that grand strategies were all just made up after the fact, you can see that they had real trouble in doing things ranging from reconciling military means with political ends all the way down to figuring out what issues were most deserving of presidential attention and time. Or if you want to think about it another way, countries that have made fundamental grand strategic miscalculations, so Germany before and during the world wars, for instance, have usually found it difficult, if not impossible, to transcend those miscalculations. So that's why I think there's no doubting the importance of doing grand strategy and making it work. The problem, of course, is that making it work isn't easy. Grand strategy is hard for many of the same reasons that it's important, because it requires tough decisions about priorities and trade-offs, because it forces you to try to impose focus and order on a chaotic international environment, because you have to reconcile short and long-term issues, even though they don't always want to be reconciled very easily. And not least of all, it's hard because you have to do all of this in real time, while you're also dealing with the frictions of domestic and bureaucratic politics, while global conditions are constantly changing and crises are breaking, and while your enemies and even your allies are doing things that you probably didn't expect and probably don't welcome. So grand strategy would be hard enough if you were just doing it in a vacuum, but in fact it's done in the real world, in an atmosphere of real chaos and friction. And so I think it's for these reasons that even at its best, grand strategy is usually just about getting things right enough rather than doing them flawlessly or perfectly. It's for these reasons that failed or frustrated grand strategies seem all too common. And it's certainly for these reasons that a number of very insightful analysts, from Stephen Krasner to Bill Clinton, have cast doubt on whether a grand strategy is even worth trying at all. What they essentially ask is that if there are this many obstacles to good grand strategy, then what point is there in even trying to pull it off? Well, I would argue that the best way to answer that question is to look at history, and to treat history as a sort of laboratory, to observe what grand strategy actually looks like and how it works in real time. And then to see how effective or ineffective it's been at helping nations achieve their fundamental goals. And so in the book I did this by looking at 4 historical case studies from the Truman Administration in the early Cold War, then the Nixon-Ford Administration in the middle Cold War, the Reagan Administration at the end of the Cold War, and George W. Bush after 9/11. Each of these administrations governed at historical inflection points in U.S. foreign policy. Each of them made serious attempts to do grand strategy, to think long-term and systematically about what they were trying to accomplish. And I think each of these cases tells us something about how grand strategy works or doesn't work in practice. So today, just for the purposes of time, I'm only going to focus briefly on the Truman and Reagan administrations. And I'm going to do so because I think that these administrations are particularly good illustrations of what a good grand strategy can actually hope to accomplish, but then also of the issues and the pitfalls that often occur along the way. So let's start with the Truman administration at the outset of the Cold War. The Truman years are generally considered to be sort of the golden age or the template for American grand strategy. It's this time of great vision, a time when giants like Kennan and Marshall and Atchison established this grand strategic blueprint that endured for decades. And in fact, during the 1990s, the search for a post-Cold War grand strategy was called the Kennan sweepstakes, the idea being that Kennan and the Truman years represented sort of the gold standard to which all aspiring strategists should aspire. And there's some truth in these assessments. If you look just at the archival record of this period, you can see, and you can't help but be impressed by the amount of serious, deliberate, conscious strategic thinking that was going on within Kennan's policy planning staff, by the Joint Chiefs, through the exercises like the drafting of NSC 68 and so on. And I think you can also see from the historical documents that really as early as 1947-48, the administration had managed to figure out 3 core grand strategic principles that really oriented almost everything it did from that point onward. And these were the following ideas. First, that containing Soviet power represented both a desirable and an achievable middle ground between appeasement and war. That in geopolitical terms, containment meant maintaining a favorable balance of power on the Eurasian landmass. And then third, that maintaining that balance primarily meant prioritizing, securing, and stabilizing the key industrial regions of Western Europe and Northeast Asia. And as I described in the book, the administration had put these insights at the core of its grand strategy from 47-48 onward, and it gradually translated them into the key initiatives of U.S. foreign policy, the Marshall Plan and NATO, the revival of Japan and West Germany, the eventual buildup of U.S. and Western military strength during the Korean War. All of these initiatives flowed from the basic ideas that I've just described, and they proved quite effective in harnessing American power to accomplish these important national ends. And if you look at how strong and prosperous the Western world was becoming at the time that Truman left office, and compare that to how weak and vulnerable it had seemed in 1947, you get a sense of just how successful the grand strategy was. So there was a lot to admire in Truman's grand strategy. It was based on a solid understanding of the Soviet threat and an accurate judgment that Soviet power actually could be contained short of war. It reflected a clear hierarchy of priorities that the administration generally managed to hold to, even amid crises and controversies. It mobilized American resources, economic, diplomatic, and military, in order to achieve ambitious but obtainable ends. And it reflected a firm commitment to long-term thinking and working progressively toward that objective of a stable Western world and a favorable geopolitical balance. And so I would just say that if this doesn't count as good grand strategy, then there's basically nothing that would. Okay, so yes, this was insightful, purposeful, and largely successful, and that's the part we usually remember about Truman-era grand strategy. What we usually forget is that Truman-era grand strategy could also be messy, problematic, and frequently in a state of flux. So the fact that the administration had a grand strategy didn't mean that it had ready-made answers to all of the problems it faced. In reality, the Truman years were a time when the administration was constantly debating the extent and limit of its global commitments, which countries were vital to American interests, which ones were not, when it was constantly struggling to reconcile its level of defense spending with those expanding commitments. I might add that they never really came up with an entirely satisfactory answer to that question of how you reconciled commitments with military spending. And the debates over these things were intense enough that they actually helped drive America's first defense secretary to commit suicide. So this was not a time of sort of rock-solid internal consensus on these things. It was a time when the administration also made some serious errors in the process of conducting foreign policy. So think about Dean Acheson's exclusion of South Korea from the defensive perimeter in early 1950, which helped lead directly to the Korean War. Or think about the even more disastrous decision to let Douglas MacArthur race north toward the Yalu later that year. Having a grand strategy wasn't a panacea for the Truman administration. It didn't free the administration from having to make tough calls in tough situations, some of which really didn't turn out very well. Now, I would just reiterate that mistakes are inevitable in foreign policy, and the administration still did very well in a big picture sense. But it's also worth keeping in mind that achieving that success required a lot of adaptation and recalibration along the way. So yes, the administration had core strategic principles that oriented it over time, but the specific policies that flowed from those principles changed quite a bit over time. Think just about NATO, for instance, or the military buildup associated with NSC 68. Neither of these initiatives were part of some comprehensive blueprint that was devised at the outset. They were policies undertaken when unforeseen international events, crises, strategic shocks, jarred at U.S. policymakers and forced them to shift the administration's methods for accomplishing its established goals. So in the case of NATO, this meant accepting that the Czech coup and the Berlin blockade had changed the European environment, that economic aid alone wasn't going to suffice to stabilize and secure Western Europe, and that you needed a formal military alliance to provide that reassurance. In the case of NSC 68, this meant accepting that a whole string of strategic shocks in late 1949 and early 1950, the Chinese Revolution, the Soviet A-bomb test, and eventually the Korean War, had altered the strategic equilibrium quite significantly, and that the United States needed a lot more military power if it was going to keep the initiative. So the point of all this isn't to heap criticism on the administration or to say that it was just making things up as it went along, because there was a grand strategic framework that structured the administration's policy choices and that structured its improvisations and adaptations in the face of these crises. The point is that this episode shows that good grand strategy is possible, but that even good grand strategy is usually a messy and an iterative process. It's something that invariably entails debates and controversies along the way. It's something that does require vision and long-term thinking, but it also requires flexibility and recalibration to get things right as conditions change. It's something that has to be worked out systematically at the beginning, but that also has to be reworked in its particulars over time. And this was a point that George Kennan himself liked to make. There was a comment he liked to give in his talks where he'd say that any policy must rest on principles, but its application must be in a constant state of flux. And I think that's a good assessment of Truman-era grand strategy and grand strategy in general. Okay, so what about the Reagan administration towards the end of the Cold War? There are still big debates today about whether Reagan had a good strategy, had a grand strategy, whether it was a good grand strategy. Although I would argue that the documents that we now have access to on both the U.S. and the Soviet sides basically put that debate to rest. It's now clear, for instance, that Reagan had spent the better part of 2 decades thinking seriously about key Cold War issues before he became president. And it's clear that he came to power with some very strongly held grand strategic ideas in mind. He thought that the Soviet Union was militarily strong, but economically, politically, and ideologically weak. He thought that a determined U.S. offensive could exploit those weaknesses and throw Moscow on its heels. And he thought that raising the costs on the Kremlin in the short term was actually the best way of convincing it to moderate its policies, negotiate, and essentially wind down the Cold War on American terms over the longer run. So he basically thought that confrontation now could facilitate diplomacy later, and that if we planned and thought long term, we could eventually fundamentally alter the Cold War order. And if you look at the subsequent course of Reagan's policies, it's striking how closely those policies adhere to his basic ideas, and how closely his intentions resembled the outcomes that were actually occurring by 1989. So during his first term, Reagan put together a wide-ranging geopolitical offensive that used a whole range of sources of pressure, from military buildup to Reagan doctrine aid to anti-communist insurgents to rhetorical and economic warfare, all to increase the strains on Moscow. And then from about 1983-84 onward, he pivoted a bit, and he used this leverage to conduct a major diplomatic offensive, one that combined pressure with reassurance and engagement, and one that was very well suited to dealing with the new Kremlin leadership that was emerging. And over time, as I argue in the book, that offensive actually convinced the Gorbachev government that it could do business with Washington, but that it also had to make real concessions in order to get the relaxation of tensions that it desperately needed. And so by 1989, that diplomatic offensive had combined with ongoing changes within the Soviet Union to bring about some really remarkable results. An unprecedented arms control breakthrough in the INF Treaty, the beginning of a Soviet retrenchment from the Third World, and basically a dramatic overall decrease in Cold War tensions. So this is an abridged version of Reagan's policies, obviously, but based on the history of the period and the documents we can now access, I think it's very difficult to deny that this was a case of an American president doing grand strategy well. It was a case of perceiving opportunities and grabbing hold of them. It was a case of using numerous aspects of American power to throw an adversary off balance and then enable a successful negotiation. It was a case of setting medium and long-term goals and then forging the policies that actually achieve those goals to a striking degree. And if the test of a grand strategy is whether a president can do this, whether he can lay out ambitious objectives and then actually accomplish them, again, it's hard to think of what a better example of grand strategy would look like. And so the accomplishments of Reagan-era strategy were quite impressive, but we also need to be careful not to romanticize that grand strategy any more than we do Truman's, because doing so actually obscures some other important points. So during the early 80s, for instance, Soviet documents now make clear that Reagan's offensive was extremely successful in exploiting Soviet vulnerabilities and restoring American ascendancy. But those same documents also make clear that Reagan's policies were so confrontational that they greatly alarmed the Soviet leadership. They reduced the prospects for near-term or medium-term improvement of superpower relations. And at one point, during the Able Archer crisis in 1983, they may actually have convinced parts of the Soviet military leadership that the United States was thinking about or even preparing to start a nuclear war. And so Reagan's grand strategy was a very high-risk grand strategy. And in fact, it was when Reagan himself realized just how high those risks had become in late 1983, that was when he began to shift gears, to tone down his rhetoric, to reduce tensions, and really to emphasize the diplomatic aspect of U.S.-Soviet relations as much as the competitive and the confrontational aspect. And of course, he had always planned to do this eventually to some degree, but it's undeniable that Reagan himself was surprised by how badly Cold War tensions had escalated in 1983, and that he understood that he needed to shift his tactics, if not necessarily his long-range goals as a result. So yes, Reagan did have a strategic vision that he consistently pursued, but he also had to be willing to learn, to adapt, to adjust as time went on. That's one thing to keep in mind about Reagan's grand strategy. Another thing is that that grand strategy, for all its successes, was not often a pretty thing to behold in practice. It involved some of the worst bureaucratic warfare in memory in Washington, which really turned leaking and bureaucratic end runs into an art form throughout Reagan's presidency. More seriously, it also entailed some real significant costs. Think about the economic costs in the form of extremely high defense budgets and large national deficits. There were what I consider to be some moral costs resulting from the fact that the Reagan doctrine just unavoidably entailed supporting some unsavory and sometimes brutal characters in the Third World. There were costs in terms of long-range blowback. There was the extent to which the covert war in Afghanistan basically made it impossible for the Reagan administration to put serious pressure on Pakistan to halt or even to slow down its nuclear program. There was the fact that some of the groups that the United States indirectly supported in that conflict went on to become the Taliban and parts of the international jihadist movement. Now, I want to make clear that it's not obvious that Reagan could have easily avoided those costs at the time without fundamentally changing his grand strategy, and you can easily argue that these costs were worth paying given the benefits. But the fact remains that there were costs nonetheless. So just to reiterate, right, it's important not to lose the forest for the trees here, and to anyone who says that grand strategy is simply a pipe dream, that it can't be done, I would simply point to Reagan as well as Truman in response, because I think that on the whole, this was about as good as grand strategy gets. But I also think this episode just reminds us that strategic vision is never flawless. The good grand strategy is about flexibility and change as well as persistence and foresight, and that even the best grand strategies have their drawbacks. Okay, so where does this leave us in terms of thinking about grand strategy and its role in U.S. foreign policy going forward? My primary takeaway is an optimistic one. I don't think that grand strategy is an illusion. I don't think that it simply can't be done. I think it's a very challenging task that previous American administrations have nonetheless managed to do quite well. Indeed, I would say that the grand strategies that the Truman and Reagan administrations pursued were absolutely essential to what they ultimately accomplished. And so if nothing else, these cases indicate that grand strategy is worth doing, and it's worth doing well. That's not to say that we're always going to get grand strategy right, and this is a point that I cover in more detail in the Kissinger and the George W. Bush chapters in the book. Just to very briefly summarize, the Nixon-Kissinger team was partially successful, but only partially successful in crafting a grand strategy to reinvigorate American primacy during a tough time in the middle of the Cold War. The Bush administration, I argue, was less successful than that in devising and carrying out a very ambitious grand strategy after 9/11. What the Nixon-Kissinger case demonstrates is that there are sometimes just limits to how far even a creative grand strategy can take you. The Bush case demonstrates that even very smart, very dedicated officials can overreach, under-execute, and get things wrong. So I am conscious that effective grand strategy can be frustratingly elusive, even for leaders who take it seriously. But it's still imperative to take it seriously just because the alternatives are so unsatisfying. If you really want to boil it down and make it simple, grand strategy is not brain surgery. It's just about trying to make hard choices in a little bit more of a systematic, coordinated, considered manner. It's just about trying to look down the road a little bit as opposed to staring directly at your feet. Opting out of grand strategy isn't going to make those hard choices about goals, resources, and priorities any easier. It's just going to mean that they're made in a less rigorous and less systematic fashion. So grand strategy is hard, and we're sometimes going to get it wrong, but what you might call grand strategic nihilism isn't a better approach. And I would say that the need to take grand strategy seriously is particularly pressing now. Grand strategic thinking is sometimes harder in a complex and fluid international environment like the one we have. It's certainly harder when resources are stretched, as they are now, but it's also more necessary. These are precisely the times when you need to think rigorously about prioritizing competing goals and interests, about how you're going to actually accomplish the goals that you set out, about establishing those general grand strategic concepts and ideas that will help you keep a fairly steady course. You'll still have to adjust and adapt along the way, but if you've done the grand strategic legwork in advance, the odds are that you'll be able to adjust and adapt more intelligently than you would otherwise, right? This is the essence of Eisenhower's quote, that it's not the plans, it's the planning. So that's my case for being moderately bullish on grand strategy, and certainly not for being dismissive of it. But I also want to make just a brief closing pitch for modesty and thinking about what grand strategy actually is and what it can reasonably hope to accomplish. As I hope this talk has underscored, grand strategy is not something that just sort of takes root in a flash of inspiration and then falls seamlessly into place. It's not a cure-all that's going to solve all of our foreign policy problems or ensure that we get all the hard calls right. It's not something that's going to eliminate the messiness of foreign policy. It's not going to eliminate the possibility that mistakes will happen and negative consequences will occur. Even at its very best, an effective grand strategy can just provide sort of enough coherence of policy, enough geopolitical foresight, so that a country can protect its most basic interests and advance towards key long-range goals. It can offer enough discipline and direction so that the adjustments and course corrections that will inevitably occur can be made more adeptly than not within a framework that keeps us moving towards those long-range objectives. Grand strategy is not going to make us totally effective in foreign policy, but I would argue that on the whole it can make us a bit more effective, more focused, and more influential than we would be otherwise. So that's the good that grand strategy can do, and I think expecting any more than that would probably be unreasonable. So I will stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions or comments.
Okay, we have about 20 minutes or so. The process is we have someone with a microphone. If you could identify yourself and then just ask one question. I have a question myself, but I'm going to save it and see if anybody else asks it first. And if they don't, at some point, I'm going to jump up and ask it.
All right.
All right? Okay, so who would like to start? Right over there. You could just take it from here.
Thanks so
I'm gonna
much
jump
for
up
being
after
here
later.
with us today. My name is Rachel O'Connell. I'm a Yale University student currently enrolled in the Grand Strategy program, which you seem to be familiar with based on your smile.
I'm a Yale grand strategy dropout, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really?
So
Oh,
what I teach a
talk about
class on
it
grand
later.
strategy, and I tell my students that if they drop out of that class, they will be condemned to teach it, as I was.
Well, I was wondering, in the classes, I'm sure you're familiar, we look at grand strategies, not just of U.S. presidents. Obviously, your book focuses on the administration level, but, of business people, of people who are international leaders. And I'm curious, how far down do you think grand strategy can scale? For example, a U.S. president can have a grand strategy. Can, say, a member of USAID? Can a member of one small, say, country office within USAID have their own grand strategy? How far down can this concept go?
Well, I mean, it all depends on how you think about grand strategy, right? So the approach that I took was basically very foreign policy centric, right? So I'm interested in looking at whether this is something that presidents can actually do. And so whether presidents operating within the essentially the modern day American political and bureaucratic system, so the post-1945, 1947 system can actually do it. And so that's why I took the approach that I did. You could conceivably extend the realm of grand strategy to go well beyond that, and that's precisely what John Gaddis and others have done up at Yale. If you are thinking about grand strategy as something as simple as reconciling means and ends and sort of thinking about what your long-term goals are and then setting out plans and courses of action in order to achieve those goals, there's no reason why those basic principles cannot apply to any number of pursuits, right? The reason that I like a somewhat narrower definition of grand strategy is that while I don't deny that the concepts are useful when you take them into all realm of endeavors, whether it be business or athletics or whatever, I think that does have a tendency to occasionally confuse the discussion of what grand strategy is in a foreign policy context. And so I took a little bit of a narrower definition to try to bring a little bit more clarity to the discussion. But as I said, I don't think there are any particularly high walls between what grand strategy's relevance in one sphere and another.
Hi, I'm Richard Hyde, private citizen. Let me give you an opportunity to think out loud here about what grand strategy should be now. If I were President Obama and I called up and said, "Dude, I've read your book. It's fabulous. Come and give me the big picture here. Help me out, okay?"
I'm not holding my breath on that one, but so I think if you're thinking about sort of what the big picture grand strategic challenge is for the United States, I think it's probably the threat of erosion of the post-Cold War order that's taken shape. So this is an international system where democracies, in particular the United States, have a clear preponderance of power, where the international system is quite conducive to the spread of democracy and free market capitalism. Basically, it's a very nice world for the United States to live in. And you can trace it further back to World War II or not, but I'm just going to take the post-Cold War era as a line of demarcation here. I think some of the things we've been seeing over the past several years indicate not that order is collapsing, but that it's potentially fraying at the edges a little bit. So if you look at the shifting balance of power in East Asia, if you look at growing Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea and that sort of thing, if you look at Russian actions in terms of essentially halting what had been a fairly steady progression of westward influence into the former Soviet sphere, and really reasserting a higher level of influence over former Soviet states like Georgia and Ukraine. If you look at the erosion of norms against the use of chemical weapons and that sort of thing, right? I think these are all indicative of sort of a fraying of the post-Cold War order. So that would be one challenge. To bring it sort of down a level, I think that the other challenge is the other threat to that order is potentially the threat that the United States will retrench too much. So I think there was an accurate reading in the administration that the United States was facing a degree of overstretch in 2008, 2009, and that there was inevitably going to be a modest ratcheting back of the ambition of American foreign policy. It is possible to take that too far, though. And if you look at sort of what sequester level spending levels or defense spending projections over the next 10 years are and what that's going to do, not in terms of sort of eroding overall American military primacy, which will still be quite secure, but in terms of changing regional military balances where we have to project power. There was actually just a very good article in International Security about this happening in East Asia. That's potentially a problem as well. And so, this is important because one of the reasons that the post-Cold War order and the post-World War II order has been so stable and peaceful by historical standards. It's not necessarily that people everywhere have discovered their inner Kant. It's that U.S. power has provided the stability that allows them to repress their inner Hobbes. And I think that that's very important to keep in mind in thinking about what the future of the international system and American policy needs to look like.
Can I ask a question? Stand up here so you can hear it. What can you tell us about, from what you've learned of the making of grand strategy, and helping us decide at the beginning of administration which is the right course to take? Much of what you say is based upon you have an administration in place, they have sort of broad goals, and they implement it, and then you measure how well they do that based upon the terms of what they've set out to do. But we all know that Ronald Reagan's vision for America was quite different than Jimmy Carter's. I would say that many conservatives' vision is different from Barack Obama's. And even if you look at the debate, even at the time of the founding of the containment policy, there were huge differences about what America was supposed to do and be. And containment was probably the most logical outcome, but it was not necessarily everything that everybody wanted to do at the time. In other words, if you're stepping back, there's no, from what I take you're saying, there's no a priori grand strategy that exists as far as you can see. It has to be discovered by the process. But what can you help us understand about how do we make the choices in principles and ends? Because if we're going into administration, and say in 2016, they're going to have people gathering around trying to figure out what to do next. How do you help us decide those big questions?
So let me just clarify something, just in response to part of your question. So there's always a tendency for new administrations to act like they're reinventing the wheel to a greater degree than they actually are. And so there are certain pieces of American foreign policy that remain more or less the same over time. So we've had a commitment to support our European allies for 70 years, 60 some odd years now, right? And so that's something that doesn't change from administration to administration. There are changes, obviously, and there are choices that do happen. And so with respect to sort of how let me put it this way. With respect to how those choices come about and how they should come about, some of them simply derive from first principles, right? So as you say, there are simply differences in the way that conservatives and liberals look at the world. And that's sort of there are deeply ingrained differences in the way they look at the world. And so that's going to structure the choices they make. In terms of how we ought to make those choices, I mean, I wish there was sort of a magic formula that would allow you to make those choices well, but I don't think there is. I think there are a couple of good ingredients that can go into it. So one is that it helps to have thought seriously about what is going on in the world and what the major trends are in the international environment for some time before coming to power. So if you look, to go back to Reagan, for instance, one of the really remarkable things to come out about Reagan in the past 10 years or so is how extensively he had thought about this stuff, going back to the 1960s and even a little bit earlier in the radio commentaries that he wrote in the 1970s. He had talked about virtually every aspect of the Cold War. He had thought seriously about it. And so that really structured the decisions that he made. You can see similar traces of this with people like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. Right? These are people who had thought about these issues very systematically over a period of time. Now, that's not always possible to do. We've had other presidents who haven't thought nearly as much about foreign policy before coming to power. I think that simply reinforces the need, though, to take the process seriously, to actually do serious strategic planning during a transition, during the opening innings of an administration, before you sort of get caught in inertia, before you get caught in simply one thing after another. And so one of the recommendations that I make at the end of the book is that there's sort of a crying need to reinvest in strategic planning capacity within the executive branch of the U.S. government. Because that's one of the areas where you actually can sit down and think systematically about these things before they happen. And it's one of those areas where you can actually start to work on getting buy-in from across the government as well. It's sort of a cliche to say that we need a new solarium exercise, right? This is the Eisenhower era exercise to sort of sit down and think systematically about various options for U.S. current strategy. But the reason that it's a cliche is that it was actually a good idea then, and it probably wouldn't be a bad idea now.
Like she said, thank you for being here. I'm Russ Reed, recent graduate of Boston University's International Relations program, and I currently am an international security writer. I just had a question regarding the current administration's policy and whether or not you think it's hints of grand strategy. What comes to mind for me personally is President Obama's recently placing the contingent of Marines in Australia, for example, or even just in the past few weeks, the Eric Holder's indictment of the Chinese nationals regarding economic espionage. Are these hints of grand strategy, or are these more reactionary actions taken just to deal with some current issues?
So, I mean, my basic take on the current administration is that there are sort of big picture grand strategic ideas that are generally orienting American policy. And so you could just sort of pick a couple of these. One would be the idea that we essentially need to do more with less, right? So the idea that the United States was overextended in 2009. We didn't want to walk back from a position of international leadership. We didn't want to walk back from an international system that had been so good to us, but we needed to do it leaner and cheaper and smarter and so on. And so you can see the influence of that belief in a number of things that the Obama administration does. You can see the influence of a belief that sort of the center of gravity in international politics is shifting, and that it's moving particularly towards the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, this was the whole idea behind the pivot or rebalancing or whatever you want to call it. So there are sort of big picture strategic ideas in place, and they are influencing things that you just mentioned, like the stationing of Marines in Darwin. The trouble with the Obama administration is I think they have often struggled to go sort of beyond the articulation of these ideas and then sort of figure out what it actually means to work towards these things. So, for instance, the Asia pivot makes lots of sense, I think. The question is how you are actually going to do that in a time of comparative fiscal austerity, at a time when the amount of resources, whether military or otherwise, that we actually have to commit to that region are probably going to be shrinking. They have struggled to do things like going down a level and translating this big idea about what it means to rebalance from the Middle East to Asia, what that actually means to do it in good order, and to think about the implications of making statements like red lines in Syria and that sort of thing. So I think there are big picture strategic ideas at play, but as I hope I pointed out, it's not just sort of establishing those ideas. It's actually figuring out what they mean in policy terms and translating them into effective policies. And I think that's where there's been a little bit more difficulty.
We have time for one more question.
Tim Christensen from National Intelligence University. Back to the executive branch suggestion there, what's the difference between grand strategy and what I read in the national security strategy of the United States?
So the national security strategy is probably one of the most derided documents in Washington, and there are lots of legitimate grievances against that entire process. The two most prominent ones are that it never gets released as early or as often as it's supposed to, and then that it ends up being sort of a bureaucratic nothing burger that doesn't actually say anything. And there's some bite to those critiques, But given the way that our system of government works, I think the crafting of the national security strategy actually is a fairly good approximation of what a grand strategic planning process looks like. It's where an administration sort of sets out its narrative, what it believes the world is headed for, what it believes the U.S. role in that world should be. And perhaps more importantly, it's the process by which the administration starts sort of ironing out disagreements over that within the administration and hopefully moving towards a position of greater consensus and sort of an ability to move forward. Now, it doesn't always actually turn out that way, but given that we have a fairly pluralistic approach to grand strategy in this country, I think the national security strategy is essentially as close as we often get to that sort of exercise. I will say that one of the issues with the national security strategy is that because it is a public document, we can't always say things as explicitly as we might like to. And so if you believe that grand strategy is about trade-offs, that entails saying that some things are more important than others. And we are reluctant to say that as clearly as we might in a public document, because once you say that something isn't important, you're annoying the people who you've said aren't important, and you're potentially opening yourself up to challenges in that area. There have been times where administrations have done classified annexes to the national security strategy. The Reagan administration did this during the 1980s, which have more sort of the hard call prioritization that you would expect to see. But that is one of sort of the perplexities of dealing with the public version of the document.
Okay. Thank you. Let's join in. Mr. Martin.